Now that we're done with the sawn frames, there are a few big jobs that we need to get out of the way before we can continue with planking. We'll make a roller assembly so that we can move the planks easier, but first I'll have to learn how to weld. Then, with the Bridgeport and metal lathe all tuned up, Joe will start working on fabricating some very important parts for Arabella.
We want to space these about 1 foot all the way down because we're just sending long lumber on them. They don't need to be right.
When it finally comes time to getting back to planking, we'll need an easier way to manipulate the long boards as we run them through the thickness planer several times. Building a roller assembly will mean that we can run the boards through and send them back for another pass without needing to pick them up again.
Foot on center. Right. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yep, got it.
So what we need to do is make a jig to go in the drill press that we can put this rail in, and we can drill the first hole 6 inches in, and then I want a slot that this will slide in, and a peg that is 1 foot from where the drill hole is.
Got it.
Does that make sense?
Yep, so then you just pick it up, put it in the peg, next
Drill.
one's 1 foot. Pick, peg, drill.
Yeah,
Got it.
and the only thing you should have to measure is where that first 6-inch hole is.
Right.
We decided this was as good a time as any for me to try my hand at welding, so Steve ran me through the basics before I tried it out on some metal scraps.
First step is to learn how to run some beads. Do not connect that and that with your bare hands.
Yeah.
There's no juice going until you pull the gun. Yeah, there's no juice going. So you could, but if you were to like hold that and bump the trigger, you would make a connection.
And then that would
kill
just
you. It would kill. Same thing when you're doing stick welding. That and that can never touch.
Yeah.
Because the gun on the stick. Yeah. See how we're blowing through? Too hot. So what you want to see is a pretty decent puddle. Could you see that?
Sort of.
Yeah, it's hard to see, huh?
Yeah.
There's a lot of splatter.
I took a bit more time to practice and get used to seeing through the visor and trying to make out the puddle through the splatter. And after a while, I felt ready enough to start putting it to work on the project at hand.
Yeah, and just make sure everything's nice and square. And then Casey, I think, is almost done with the other rail.
Alright, I'll go grab some spring clamps
And then I have enough laid out for all of the 10-foot rails and then the end pieces for the 2 short rails.
Jacob, who's been helping us with all things metal since we started with the bronze floors, was still in the area. He came by to check on my progress with the welding, and after we ran out of wire for the MIG welder, he took the time to teach me how to stick weld as well.
Yeah, we're getting there. What we can do is try on a bit of scrap metal to get a feel how it burns.
Just letting it bleed like
Yes. And just let it rest and push it a little bit. Yeah, like this. Just slow. Yeah. Yeah. Slowly. better?
There was a long way to go with the roller assembly, and we'll see it set up and running in the next video. But after just finishing this one section of it, I was glad to have my first day of welding under my belt.
Yeah, that should be strong enough anyway.
We're working back here on the prop shaft assembly, and the prop shaft is going to go right in through here. So obviously we need to drill a hole through the stern post for that. And there needs to be some hardware in there to protect the stern post and to make sure that that prop shaft has a bearing to ride in. So on the outside edge here, we have a cutless bearing that we'll end up installing. And there's this notch here that we hacked out earlier with the chainsaw. And that was so that we could put a bolt in here that's going to be countersunk deeper than the cutout for the prop shaft. So although this hole is really ugly right now, eventually it's going to get bigger and cut out, and that's where the prop's going to land. But for now, we're just leaving that kind of ragged. So on the outside here, we've got the cutless bearing, and we need a liner to protect the timber and keep any of the creepy crawlies that want to eat the wood out. Now on the inside, what Victoria had was what's called a rigid stuffing box. So there's a packing nut on the outside, and there's this compressible material. They used to use flax on the inside. And what happens is your prop shaft goes through, and then you crank this nut down and it compresses that packing around your prop shaft, and that's what stops any of the water from leaking into the boat. We're going to use the same kind of thing on Arabella, but we're going to use a more modern version, and it's a flexible stuffing box. So the stuffing box principle is the same, except it, believe it or not, uses a really heavy-duty hose to connect onto this plate that mounts onto the stern post. And that way, when the prop starts to spin, that packing housing can just tweak ever so slightly, and it really helps reduce the impact on that. So we can't get a commercial one available that matches the angle on the stern post. So if we were to buy one, it would kind of look something like this, and we would have to cut out this huge notch and make a shelf in the stern post, which we don't really want to do. So instead, we are going to take this and a big old chunk of plate, and we're going to make our own inside one that is very similar to this, but at the angle for the stern post. And then we can attach the stuffing box to this after we turn it down and drill it out.
We go part way. Once we get halfway through it, we can take the clamp off. Oh, good.
While Joe continued with boring out the tube, I got the measurement off the stern post so that we can cut through the plate at the proper angle to be level with the shaft.
since we've got to put a hole through this at
That angle.
that angle,
Yep.
we have two options. We leave the plate like this, and we tip the head like this.
Mm-hmm.
Or we have to put the plate up
So
like
that it
this.
drills straight down through.
It would be easier if I can hold it that way. That's where I would start, and you pick around the outside of it, because you can't go through, well, not with that end mill anyway.
Though it was a good angle for Joe to work with, we would need to find a way to clamp it securely.
I gotta be able to clamp it down and clamp it down on this side. This is gonna hold it here, but it's not enough to keep her from
kicking out.
doing things. Just
We came up with a solution which involved welding on a small shelf that would give the clamp something to hold on to.
Okay.
Then, like I said, just two tacks over here.
Okay. Cool.
Due to the angle of the cut, nothing in our small collection of milling attachments was able to get all the way down to remove the rest without hitting other parts of the plate.
How long is it going to take to do all of it with this?
We're not going to be able to do all of it with this,
No.
because it isn't long enough.
So what's going to be the solution for doing the whole thing?
We got to buy some boring bars.
So while we ordered and waited for something long enough to finish milling, we got to work on some other jobs that needed some preparation. What we're doing here is setting up for drilling out a tube of a hard plastic called Delrin. Later, this will line the shaft through the stern post and sit in between the stuffing box and the cutless bearing. But before we can bore out the tube, we need to make a steady rest to hold all of these long pieces steady while it spins in the lathe. The tall plate standing up at the end here will have a circle cut out with 3 rollers attached around it that will secure the tube and keep it perfectly centered at both ends while the long drill bit works its way through. We'll show you how that works out next week. The boring bar for the Bridgeports came in a few days later, and Joe was finally able to get back to work on cutting out the plate. Then, it was back over to the lathe to finish the tube. You will notice in the center that there is a boss, or a shoulder. This is because although it was close, the hole ended up being ever so slightly larger than the attachment point for the stuffing box. Since the larger end sticking out of the plate will be set into the wood of the stern post, we don't want to have to cut any extra shape into the wood to make it fit snug. This last cut on the inside end of the tube will make a perfect fit for the Delrin that will line the stern post. We'll do something similar to the cutless bearing we took from Victoria that accepts the other end.
Hey, that looks perfect. We're just hitting the shoulder here, which looks pretty good.
I think I'd like to bring it up a little bit so that when I weld, the shoulder's above the weld.
Okay.
I think somewhere in there would be better.
While the welder was out, we figured it was as good a time as any to fix the 100-year-old shovel that Steve found as a kid. And it was perfectly boat-sized too.
Went right through.
Mm-hmm.
Can you get me a big cold chisel? I took out the damage material.
Mm-hmm.
Took a little playing around with the settings, but we finally got it in the end. After the pieces were ground down, all that was left was a quick trip through the sandblaster.
And this is the final product. So this is what we ended up making. Well, Joe really ended up making. So this will mount onto the stern post like that. You can see we don't have to do any sort of notches or rebates or anything for it. And then this will get let into the stern post. Our stuffing box will get clamped onto this side of it. We still got to drill a couple holes to put some lag bolts in. And then on this back side, we put a 3/8 inch rebate. So when we install this, what we'll do is the Delrin will get nestled down into that on the inboard edge. And we're going to take Victoria's old cutless bearing and we're going to mill the same thing on the inside of that. So that when the stern assembly gets in the water and swells up, that Delrin can stay put and it can stretch a little bit out of the sockets here that we're going to cut on either end of it, but still be making contact with the bronze. And that way, as that whole assembly swells a little bit, that entire inside of the stern post will still be protected. And like we said, the big reason for making this was that if we were to buy something commercially available, it would be 90 degrees like this. And we would have to cut this huge notch out of the stern post. And then we're going to cut a big notch over here as well for the propeller. And then we're going to bore a 1.5 inch hole down the middle of it. So it takes out a lot of timber. And since we had the capabilities to make a new one like this and to not have to cut in that big rebate, make that big shelf, and take all that out of the stern timber, we thought that was a good call. So huge thanks to Joe for doing all the machining. He's basically been living here every other day helping us get this done. And also huge thanks to Kathy and Paul again for letting us have the Bridgeport and the metal lathe. Without that, we wouldn't be able to do it. So the next step is we got to get the Delrin drilled out, and we got to set up a boring bar, which both should be much simpler tasks than creating this. And then we can get this drilled, get all of that installed, and get back to planking, which we are really anxious to do. When you're setting up the engine and the prop shaft and all of that assembly, there's a bunch of different ways to do it. And we know that there's going to be a lot of you who agree with how we're doing this, and there's going to be a lot of you who probably vehemently disagree with how we're going to go about doing this. But just know that we've talked to Brooke and John. Brooke's from Nanny Diesel and John is from Hanson Marine. That's where we got the diesel engine. And from talking with them and other experienced cruisers and shipwrights, we really believe that a very simple system for the prop shaft, especially with where we want to go and what we want to do voyaging down the road, is really important. So this is a really kind of old school, tried and true method to doing it. There's a lot of different ways, and we're super interested to hear what you have to say about that. So let us know in the comments. Just please keep it constructive so that we can all learn from this and see all the different ways and nuances of doing this. And if you keep it constructive, we are a lot more likely to listen to you.